Everyone online, welcome to our session about panel discussion, automation for identity and access management. This is a very important topic, and we have our amazing panel members already there. We will have May Sarout, Global Head Identity and Access Management from Scotiabank. We have Dorin, National Canadian Digital Identity Lead from Accenture. And we have Joseph, Technical Specialist, Security, Compliance, and Identity from Microsoft. And our panel moderator, David Lee, founder and president on the Corner Media Group. And also people usually call him I am Jedi. David will be our panel moderator. So I will pass the control to David. And David, feel free to take over from there.
All right, thanks, Brian. Welcome, everybody. We are really excited to have this panel. Let me speak for everybody else. I'm excited to have this panel because I love identity. Anything about identity, I love having it. And we have a great set of panelists today to continue the theme of automation, right? And we've been having some great meetings already today talking about security automation and the things that are important, how you go about that through your organization. And so now we're going to focus the next 30 minutes with my esteemed panelist here. We're going to talk about how you do some automation with identity and how that works into your organization. So with that, let's get straight to it. Brian has been gracious enough to introduce all of our panelists. So let's just jump into the questions.
Let's do that.
Before we do that, actually, let me pause. Let me do that. How's everybody doing? How you guys? How are you doing today?
We're very excited. We are excited as you are, David.
Thank you, David. All good.
All right, we're gonna have a good time today. We're gonna teach everybody some things. We're gonna have some good discussions. We're gonna have some fun doing it. I might throw in some dad jokes in there and see people laugh. Who knows? We'll see. All right. So to kick it off, our first question, really, when we looked at this, we kind of discussed this, right? When you hear the words "I am automation," right? What does that mean to you? So I want to kick this off. Let's start with Dorin. When you hear that "I am automation," what's the first things that kind of come to your mind?
Thanks, David. Great question. A simple one, but yet very complicated to answer, I would say. Because depending on who you're talking to within organization, identity and access management may mean different things, right? If you're talking to someone who's serving the external customers, obviously identity and access means way different, and the priorities will be way different, focusing on the user experience, focusing on time to market for the services perspective. If you talk to someone who needs to enhance the security controls or provide a better experience for the employees or third parties, that means way different. And then we get into much complicated areas, like when we talk about the secrets management, we're talking to the application development team. That's a whole different ball game altogether, right? And lastly, but probably not the least one, is if we talk to cloud transformation, when everybody is excited to have everything at fingertips. Essentially, I move to the cloud, I have everything, and everything is an identity now. And the expectation is that, well, the traditional, so to speak, identity practice has to be as fast as cloud. Then there is a wrong expectation set up right there upfront. So what I'm trying to say is that although it's a simple question, the answer will really depends who you're talking to, and may have a different angle. And what as part of my experience is really as you just asked, is when starting the conversation about identity is really understand, having that dialogue, understanding the partner you're talking to. What do you mean by identity? What identity and access means to you, and what you're trying to get out of it. If it's security enhancement, it's one domain. If it's user experience, will be slightly different. Balancing both will be even more complicated. So yeah, I think that's probably my starting point on identity and access management domain.
All right, May, what about you? What are your thoughts on that?
I love it. Actually, I think so Brian introduced me. I've been doing identity for like 13 years, so I love identity a lot. And I wanted to say, I always say identity is so complex. IAM is so complex, and it's everywhere. Unlike most of the other security domains, they're just focus on one topic. Identity is basically everywhere and everything. So it's very complex. So I loved what Dorin said. I was smiling as he was saying it. But if I want to give another view to our participants here in this webinar or summit, I would say the way I look at it, I focus on the internal customers, the employees or staff, and I also look at it from the life cycle management of the identity. So identity, you create the identity, you use the identity, you get access, you use it, then you revoke it and you review it. So from the life cycle, I would look at automating each of those as much as possible. So I automate request and approval, automate provisioning and deprovisioning when someone no longer needs it, and as they leave the organization, you want to automate revocation as quickly as possible. So I look at it from that and say, okay, where can I automate as much as possible? Right. There's other places, but that's one view. But I can talk for another half hour on automation. Turn it over to Joseph. Maybe he has another idea on automation or view of automation.
No, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, we're all hitting kind of these huge points when it comes to identity access management. When you really think about it, it's identity and access management. How long does the identity need to be there? How does it get integrated into your systems? How do they access all your resources, your applications, and everything like that? And how can you really automate that, right? Especially coming from a little bit of background on the security side, right? With identity being such the focal point for security and really needing to defend against it.
Yeah.
How long does someone need to have access to a resource? Do they need access to the resource? You mentioned it, the deprovisioning. Once a user leaves or changes roles, should they have access to the same kind of resources? And how can you automate those things so that it's not checking a box saying, yep, they're no longer in this role, let's remove access here. So, I mean, so many great points were brought up already. I don't want to keep adding on to those because absolutely it's a 30-minute conversation just on that one point.
Awesome. So I want to continue on a point you brought up there, Joseph, and we'll start with you and kind of go around the panel. So in that aspect, right, looking at automation for IAM, how do you see it helping your security posture, right? So if there's a panelist out that's listening right now, they've been listening and they've been seeing security automation all day. So now they're talking about identity, right? And we've hit on a couple of different topics. Maybe brought up deprovisioning. You kind of talked about the access. Let's dive into like how that can really help them, fix their security posture by bringing some automation to identity and access management.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're thinking about all these identities and resources that they're accessing and how long they should be accessing these things, once you start to enable these and kind of manually doing these, you start to realize that you might be over provisioning users, right? And when you over provision users, they have too much capabilities inside the environment. They just have too much access. And some things might not even be access that they really need. In case of an assumed breach mentality, if that user is impacted, what kind of resources do they now have access to that wouldn't normally be something that they should have access to? So when you start to look at how to automate these things, and I mean, automation into the identity can come from a multitude of things like HR provisioning, you got the inter-domain provisioning, you even have application provisioning and everything like that. But really keeping this focused around the security side, keeping it a streamlined experience, all users are going through the same things, maybe even going through enabling like access packages where they can go through request certain accesses to different levels of applications and user levels inside of it so that if there were something to happen, they don't have keys to the kingdom, if you want to think of it that way. And throw it on top of it, right? The identity becoming that central focus for security. It really is. Keeping it where they are always least privileged. And how can you start to automate their privilege levels so that they don't always have access to maybe a global admin inside of an environment or a user admin where they can really start to make an impact on it. Have the user start to go through and request access and then have an automation process to get things approved for them as well.
Yeah, Meg, what are your thoughts there?
I want to add, I fully agree, and also want to add other things from a security perspective to reduce risk for an organization. Sometimes we focus on just like the provisioning, as you said, but there's other things where you could do that or reduce the risk. For example, in the privileged access management space, you can go discover accounts that are not managed in your PAM tool so that there is no blind spots out there. So the more we have discovery capabilities that are automated, because there's lots of systems, databases, applications, infrastructure. So the more automation capabilities we have to discover privileged access, the less risk we have for the bank. So that's another area it's kind of like a foundational area. to make sure you have all the privilege they can. Another one, it's related to segregation of duty or toxic combinations. So if you're supposed to do A, you're not supposed to do B. So automating, if you can, automating the access as it is being requested and before it's actually granted, to stop it from being granted to someone to say, well, this is too much access, or these two things should not be granted to a person, is critical versus finding it after the fact and trying to revoke it. So if you can automate detection and prevention by making sure that the access is not even granted in the first place, that's actually better than just doing it after using an IGA tool. Another way of securing. And then also ensuring least privilege. I think the most common word in IAM is least privilege. So all of that is leading to that posture.
I can probably add a little bit. It's hard when you're speaking third, when everybody covered 99.9%. Maybe I'll just top up a little bit with the elements of by increasing secure posture. So automation just takes an existing security control by defining a new one, and you automate it. So any automated control is better than a manual one. That's kind of a given.
Right.
So that's one of the benefit you organization will take out of automation. But also on top of that, it's getting the traceability that sometimes we lose when we have the manual control. So given the example about the request provisioning and all the way to deprovisioning and certification, by having the right automation, not just an automation, we could benefit from that easy traceability for many purposes, just for audit purposes or for own investigation, or just to make sure we can have a process improvement. However, there is an element of caveat in here, is that, well, if your controls are not effective by automating it, you make it worse. So I just want to make sure that we set the expectations when we embark on automation, is that it's not the plug in play type domain. It's automation. You have to define what you automate, and the problems that you have now will just become problems at a very, very much higher speed. So it's not that it will remove your problem. So being very careful there, and also it may or may not make the user experience better. Even during taking the example that probably May is probably closer to this domain when making access requests, right? Is if you can automate, but if you don't have all the attributes or all the requestable items in place correctly, then guess what? The request will happen automated. The provisioning will not. So you're really not automating much.
Right.
So there is element of that as well. I think the most that we see when we talk automation, a lot of organizations will correlate to secrets management, so application to application authentication. That'll be, I would say, a very direct sometimes for the IT people, or people who mostly involved in the software development, that they'll say, okay, now I can securely use secrets and that the keys will be provisioned faster. But again, you're relying on another automated tool that you have to design very carefully, not to be your single point of failure.
Great stuff there, Dorin. So we're going to bring in some questions from the audience. We've got some in here. First one that comes in is, how can we automate identity governance to meet various compliance requirements? Who wants to?
I'll start with that.
Okay.
I think the vendors in that space, the IGA vendors, I think they started by compliance more than security. So it is intended to help organizations, especially after the NNON and the SOX Sarbanes-Oxley regulation, that access certification came from compliance. It didn't come from security risk. So I think that's the premise, in my opinion, that's the foundational reason why we had IGA tools. And there, I think Dorin was saying that you can actually use a solution, an IGA solution from a vendor, and have it do a lot for you, or you can actually use it but not have it do a lot for you, and have a lot of people feeding and caring for it. So I think the IGA helps you meet compliance as long as you know how to use it. I think is my my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I'm right there with you. Compliance and security, they do start to overlap with it.
Yeah.
Obviously, coming from my side, on the Microsoft side, we do have things like Compliance Manager that you could run by, and it does overlap with these security features and enabling these MFAs and doing all these things, because at that point, it does start to lean into that, right? So
Yeah.
creating these provisionings and going through and starting to enable, conditional access and multi-factor authentication, however is needed for those compliance standards, working off checklists to make sure that those things are enabled and everything like that. That would be kind of the way to do it, right? Taking a look at that compliance. What things need to be met? Which ones can you hit right out of the gate? Which ones are easily able to be implemented, right? And then kind of build upon that foundation.
Mm-hmm. And I think that I was just going to add one more thing. We started using CIAM, Cloud Identity Entitlement Management, and those tools come also with like frameworks that are aligned with the regulations and security frameworks. So a lot of vendors are already embedding regulation so that you can comply. So you can just say, okay, I'm compliant 90%. I only have these 2 areas to work on. So that helps you even assess your compliance to the regulations and frameworks.
All right. Jumping from another question from our audience, are there ways that we can automate access provisioning or deprovisioning to applications that don't support SSO?
Yes, I don't think those two, let me clarify. SSO is very important from a security perspective, and I think now that we're more into the cloud, MFA, SSO MFA is one of the first defenses we have, or one of the easy defenses we have. But provisioning and deprovisioning is not tight correlated to SSO. There's one thing that is between the two that is common, which is you need to know who is the person to let them in, authenticate them using SSO. But knowing that who is David in this system or who's May allows you to also go, okay, now I'm going to remove their access if they left the bank, or if they come in and say I want access to this, you then know how to, what identity to use to grant them access. So both rely on having an identity, digital identity for the person to be able to authenticate them, but also grant them access. But those solutions we refer to IGA have connectors that allow you to, and there's a lot of vendors that have a lot of connectors that can easily, some claim 7,500 connectors, some of the ones we use has also hundreds and hundreds. So you have out of the box connectors that make it a lot easier for you to get the data you need from these systems, but also allow you to provision and deprovision easily.
I probably can add a little bit to that. If we understand the question correctly, if an application doesn't support single sign-on, I would say standards or protocols, if there are ways of provisioning access to it, in my experience, we always find a way to do it. What I mean is that it's either you change the application, or you find some middle ground where you use application servers in between. So there are ways of doing it. It's obviously the complexity grows in as we keep the applications more in the legacy state. So we don't modernize them or upgrade or modify or migrate, whatever the case is be it. So to keep up to date to the industry protocols, right? For WAF or OpenIDC Connect, whatever that the case is. Right. If you get into that situation where application cannot support, then obviously we're getting the customization topic, which is, it depends on the value that you get. If it's a major application that serves a lot of users or a lot of clients and it has a really meaningful business need, then it's worth the investment. If not, then maybe it's not worth the investment to make that automation investment.
Right.
Absolutely agree with Dorin, right? Modernizing applications is also going to be a huge component of it, right? Getting so that you can have that single sign-on experience, right? It just makes the end user's experience and the user's experience that much better, where they're not having to remember passwords and doing all this stuff. They're just getting that single sign-on to all the applications that are provisioned to them. It makes everyone's life easier if the capability is there, of course.
Yeah.
Right. One thing we used to always say, if it has an API or a database table, we can provision to it.
Exactly.
There's the hooks. Yep.
May not be pretty.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Another question coming from the audience. Can you comment on IAM for IoTs and applications? What do you recommend to better manage the access for them? I think this one kind of goes to like Dorin and May, as you guys started, like the things we love about IAM, right? It's this big little niche industry, right? There's so many things to cover there. So yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, right? So when you think about IoTs, and I'm expanding a little bit, right? We got IoTs with applications. I think it was, I don't know if it was Justin or Dorin. Sorry, they mentioned like, it was Dorin. You got secrets management. You got all these things, right? As we start to look at this new age of everything's an identity, right? All these little things, right? So I would kind of broaden this a little bit as we look across the landscape and say, okay, identity is no longer just May's account, right? It's May's account, it's May's phone, it's the service that she connects to in AWS, it's this thing that she's running, just all these little things as we start to broaden that scope of identities. What are some things when we're thinking about like automation of ways that customers can get a better grasp of how they manage all that? We'll start with Joseph.
Yeah, so I mean, the applications are always going to be a huge one, right? The provisioning into applications, it does go back to how are you going to set those ones up, and it does go to some of those open standards, right? Where you're starting to enable some of these connectors into there, and you're starting to add your users into it, and then you're provisioning these users to automatically be added to those applications with those thresholds and levels that they're going to work through, right? And as you're doing that, it leads into the governance of the identity too, right? Because now you have that single source, right? Maintaining that single source so that you're not utilizing identities across the board, right? Me as an individual should have the one identity, not identity here, identity here, identity here. For the security standards, I mean, just think about it. If something were to happen, now you have to deprovision all those user accounts, opposed to if you had something with an application you're provisioning the users into there, you could remove the one core account, and now they no longer have access to all of those systems, right? And so that's one of the biggest things about applications, right? Create the core account, provision out, and then if something were to happen, roles change. Maybe you had the HR provisioning and now the role changed and you had dynamic groups, and we don't have to go all the way in that way. But as things change, they're no longer having access to those ones because maybe they have access to new systems. They have access to new applications and new permissions in those applications. So keeping that kind of core functionality around the application provisioning is a core part of it.
So I really try to read deep into the question to understand it. In our comment, IAM for IoT. So if I understand correctly, the question is that how we manage the access and how I would say we secure the access to it. The one element what I say, but for IoT again means a lot of things. If is it are we talking if it's pure devices that you just need the discovery and just manage the life cycle of it when it appears or not, or there is actually some interactive access to it, which is a whole different ballgame. If I would just focus on the IoT as a pure device, one I don't think there is much difference in terms of how you manage the access. It's really for what May mentioned as a follow the life cycle. What do you try to try to achieve? I think the biggest challenge is to discover. Once it's plugged in, it's there. You don't know what that IoT device does or does not. Which brings into one of the good practices when it comes to IoT and applications so on is also think about how you segment your network. We always sometimes we see cases where IoT devices and sit in the same network as users, or there are any other applications. And the challenge with IoT devices so far is that they do not get patched or upgraded as fast as any other, let's say, applications that has interactive access. Think about healthcare devices, or think about the IoT devices in resources like that has specific OS. They have specific meanings, and the vendors, it's their life cycle to be modernized is way different, because they were built specific for a specific purpose, and the vulnerability for those to be caught and to be patched is slow in many cases, just because of the nature of IoT devices. The impact is much higher than just a user impact. So I would take from the perspective is that what's the purpose of that IoT device? Follow the life cycle, and also isolate it, so that if there is if in case of vulnerabilities, it's the damage is also isolated.
All right, we're coming right up on 5 minutes, so I want to kind of close with this, and talk about best practices for this, right? And we've kind of, I think, hinted at a little bit of it, right? But we've talked about the importance of it and where IAM sits and looking at the life cycle. And May, I want to start with you on this one. When if you've got an up and coming identity person, right? They are we've all been in this, like many years, right? They're a couple of years into this, they're really excited, and they're like, May, I got this project and I gotta go automate like my provisioning and my deprovisioning, and they're like, I don't know where to start. And they come to you and say, May, where do I start? Help me, Obi-Wan. Where do I start? What would you tell them?
All right, so I want to cover both where do we start and best practices, and I think they kind of intersect at one point. So you gotta start where it makes the biggest bang. So and also so highest value, lowest effort. So Dorin said earlier, as you automate requests and approval and provisioning, if it's too complicated, you cannot easily automate it. You cannot let automated provisioning, because there's so many different ways to provision access. So what you want to do is focus on the ones where there's a lot of consumers requests you expect, and also the actual provisioning is the easiest part. So this way you enable the business to remove that off your plate. You get the biggest bang, as they say, for the buck. At the same time, I think from a best practices perspective, you want to automate the things that are straightforward. Like you don't want to automate, you don't want to, like, the 80-20 rule. You don't want to spend all your energy and time on the 20% that is very complex and very niche and very unique. You want to go with the 80%. That's where you want to do your automation. I'm not just talking provisioning, anything, even discovery. So for example, discovery, some of the PAM vendors for discovering privileged accounts went with the easy one, Active Directory. That's very easy because it's all centralized. And then they went with Unix. They haven't done a good job on databases yet, and we're struggling with that because it's not as easy. But you start with the ones that gets you that has the biggest population or volume or users, and then you actually go with the ones that are easier to do. I would say best practices, and then how you start the journey. One of the things with challenges, I saw someone has a challenge question with automation, is data. If your data is not good, the decision making, like if you don't have a good book of record of your people, or a good book of record of your systems, or who owns what, you can't automate much. So your data is your core. It's a key challenge for automating anything, but it's one of the key challenges in identity. You need good data records, book of records for you, and maintain the life cycle of the people and the assets and the owners and other things for you to be able to automate things.
Awesome. All right, quick hitters. We'll go Dorin and Joseph as we wrap up here for our discussion here. Dorin, best practices.
Set your expectation right from the beginning, and understand what you gain, what you're not gaining. We see, the cloud transformation, I would say, trend, which is a trend. Set the expectation that, well, I get all the IAM automation right there. I don't need anything else. I just move to the cloud. Everything is there. Why do I need more? when you roll back and you understand, well, until you get to the cloud and until you actually can use some of the native capabilities, you'll still be in the hybrid mode for a very, very long time.
Right.
So I would say remove remove identity and access management from your journey right away, just thinking, well, cloud will give me everything. It will, but it's a journey, not on day one.
Yeah. All right, Joe, send us home.
Yeah.
Treat identity as that primary security perimeter, right? I'm going to keep hammering that in, right? Enabling that, centralize your identity management and plan for those routine security improvements. It's an ever evolving field. Keep updated with it. Keep implementing the new security features to keep yourself secure.
All right. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to all the guests for coming in and the questions. Thanks to Brian for having us. This has been IAM Automation Panel. We'll see you guys.
And thank you, David.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Excellent.
very much.
David.
Great to hear your insights. And thank you for coming to share with us your great insights. And for people online, thank you very much for joining, and hope you get a lot of values from our industry experts.
Bye,
All
everyone.
right. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye for now.